So my name is Tom Leonard. I'm President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at TPI, and this is the panel on current developments in antitrust policy. We have an extremely distinguished panel with extremely impressive credentials, but because we are short of time, I'm only going to kind of introduce them with the top line and then get the discussion started. Dennis Carlton is the David McDaniel Keller Professor of Economics Emeritus at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, and also a Senior Managing Director at Compass Lexicon. Carl Shapiro is a Distinguished Professor at the Graduate School of the Haas School of Business in the Department of Economics at the University of California at Berkeley. Howard Shalansky is Professor of Law at Georgetown University, where he holds the Sheehy Chair in Antitrust Law and Trade Regulation, and a partner in the law firm of Davis Polk and Wardwell. And Christopher Yu is Imisogi Professor in Law and Technology at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Professor of Communication, Professor of Computer and Information Science, and Director of several centers at the University of Pennsylvania. We have a wealth of experience on the panel in the government at high levels in the antitrust agencies as well. Let's start with talking about the legacy of the Biden administration as far as antitrust is concerned. The Biden team, Lena Khan at the FTC and Jonathan Cantor at the Antitrust Division, were outspoken that they considered the previous 40 years of antitrust enforcement to be a failure, and they attempted a fairly dramatic course change. They thought that we had a significant market and growing market power problem that was at least partly due to lax antitrust enforcement. And they adopted a more populist approach than previously, which included major cases against some of the largest and most prominent big tech companies. They revised the merger guidelines and the Hart-Scott-Rodino reporting procedures, which made merger approval more difficult and more costly. So the first question for the panel is, what do you think the Biden team accomplished? Did it accomplish what they hoped to accomplish, and will there be lasting effects? Maybe I'll just go down, starting with Dennis, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, as with any policy, there were good and bad aspects, but my own view is it was generally negative, and that it'll be viewed historically as a submission to populist sentiment that was generally hostile to big companies and especially high tech. I think it was a step backward because it represented a demotion of economic analysis and instead replaced it with what had gone on in the, say, 40 years or earlier, a reliance on, you might say common sense notions, but common sense notions that sometimes didn't pan out. A reliance on old Supreme Court cases that even antitrust scholars and antitrust economists don't believe would be upheld today. It was a stress on market shares, where I think virtually every antitrust practitioner understands that market definition and shares aren't a formulaic exercise, but rather the place to begin, not end an analysis. Hostile, why do I say hostile? If you read the merger guidelines, the 2023 guidelines, they use the word may a lot. This may harm competition. Well, you know, I was lucky enough to have an office down the hall from Ronald Coase, very famous economist, and he would complain a lot about young economists. I was then young. And he said, you always end your articles by saying this may have antitrust implications. Let me tell you, when you see a sentence with may, you can also substitute may not. So just remember that. Hostile because they would not recognize that there could be fixes to, for example, mergers. Hostile because I don't think it was just me. In general, I noticed that it was much more difficult to have interaction with government agencies and government economists. And in some cases, it was very hard to get meetings. Finally, I'll end by saying I thought it was a disservice to try and make unclear the objectives of antitrust, especially at the FTC, but just generally, the notion that there could be goals for antitrust that are just something other than, they always referred to it as consumer welfare. I think that was just semantics. I would say economic welfare of society is something that the competitive process, we know something about how it works. It was to say, I don't want you to just focus on things like price, innovation, and output. I want you to start worrying about things like the level of employment. I don't mean market power against workers. That is a valid concern. But I mean the level of employment or income distribution. Now, there's nothing wrong with those goals, and someone should worry about them. But to make antitrust, to think that antitrust should worry about a whole bunch of goals is misguided. A policy that has so many objectives that you don't know how to weigh them will wind up being an ineffective policy. So my view is we'll look in retrospect and we'll say, how in the world did we want to turn back the clock that far?
So, Carl, when you answer the question, could you also maybe address what I think was one of their predicates, and which I mentioned, was that we have a market power problem, and I guess even a growing market power problem, at least partly due to lax antitrust enforcement.
Well, so I think one of the problems with normally I'm a counterpoint to Dennis. I'm more interventionist, more, I would say, in terms of antitrust, but I'm have to largely agree with Dennis that the Biden antitrust legacy is one of a very sad one, and I'm sad to say that. Part of the reason, to go to your question, Tom, specific question, is that it was built on a false narrative that we'd had this dramatic increase in market power and a very lax failure of antitrust for 40 years. This was a populist narrative that fit with a lot of other things that are going on in the economy, such as changes in the distribution of income, increased inequality, decline in the share of labor, of GDP, and so forth. But I've written a paper recently with Ali Urkoglu at Stanford called Trends in Competition in the United States. What does the evidence show? It's on my website. It'll be coming out in publication in a few months now. And we show that this story about generalized, widespread increases in market power does not hold up in the data. If you just look at the data, we've really read the literature. So this was part of the problem. But this narrative was because this was a political populist thrust that motivated this. And so they grabbed onto that narrative. And there are elements in the evidence about that. I mean, there are increases in concentration at the sectoral level, but not so much at the market level, at antitrust market. So there's a false narrative here. And beyond that, though, Tom, to add a little to what Dennis said, if you look at the different components of antitrust, normally what the big difference an administration can make is on mergers, because that's a lot of activity, M&A. I think that Biden, it's clearly a failure in that area. The policy's a failure. They had the lowest enforcement rate for several decades in terms of challenge deals as a percentage of Hart-Scott-Rodino filings. Their win rate was somewhat lower. They had this policy of not entering into consent decrees, basically not settling cases, which is retarded, okay, because there's nothing wrong with settling cases, okay, but I think what happened is they didn't want to get attacked from the left from people saying, oh, you let this merger through with only these conditions. And then they felt they were on their back foot. So that was a very poor policy. The merger guidelines they wrote, while they're still in place, they're a big step backward, I would say, from the previous ones. because they're just much less clear and guidance about how companies are supposed to actually tell whether the merger will be challenged or not. So mergers is a big failure. On the monopolization front, that's where they really were more aggressive. They really weren't on mergers. I mean, they tried to, they tried to sort of scare off mergers, but that scared good and bad. On monopolization, they have a number of big cases, right? They continued some from the Trump administration, particularly the Google search case and the Facebook acquisitions. But they brought a number of others. A second Google case, Apple, and some other ones. You've got, Live Nation, for example. So, but it's just, we don't know yet how those are going to turn out. Okay, those cases are still working their way through. The Google ad tech case, that's a win for them so far. So that's, I say, to give them credit for that, if credit or blame, I guess, depending on how you see it. I mean, how those will work out when they, through the district court and the appellate process remains to be seen. And then people's views will differ on, even if they win those cases, whether that's actually a good thing or a bad thing. That'll be a debate. I think the big success of the Bidens was just Biden antitrust was this antitrust movement. Okay, I shouldn't say success. What they fueled, as Howard tells me, other people tell me, law students these days, they want to get into antitrust because Lena Khan is a rock star, okay? So the biggest success of all, I would say, is really fueled her career.
So, Howard, would you consider the question maybe also address the question that Carl just raised about the monopolization cases, whether they deserve credit for them or blame for them, or obviously they're not all the same. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the monopolization cases signal one other thing I think that's worth talking about. When we talk about legacy, we want to talk about sort of carryover. What has endured, what might endure from the Biden era. And in some sense, the big monopolization cases that were brought had actually been started in the first Trump administration. So there was carryover, the case against Facebook, now Meta, of course, case against Google. These were initiated in the first Trump administration by Joe Simons at the FTC and Macon Delrahim at the DOJ. They were carried over with, I think, a lot of fervor in the Biden administration, and we don't see any indication of backing off in the current Trump administration of those legacy cases. So I do think that a revamping of concern about bigness and a concern about monopolization is one thing that maybe had been building for a while, maybe started with a more populist view in the first Trump administration, got a lot of fuel in the Biden administration and has continued. So, and I do think that we will see sort of increased attention to various kinds of, unilateral conduct, single firm conduct, as opposed to mergers and collusion that will endure. And some of that is due to, not just in the merger guidelines, but more generally, concern over conduct that, as Dennis said, may harm competition. And I think as we see bigger and bigger companies having more and more impact on everyday life, we may see sort of increased attention to conduct that may affect competition and a more aggressive posture that endures there. One other thing that I think is an important legacy point is this. It's not just that, Lena Khan became a rock star and I had to get a massive auditorium when she came to speak to my antitrust class because half the school wanted to come see her speak. There is some handoff from the populism on the left to the populism on the right and the concern about bigness. Lena Khan went on Steve Bannon's podcast to talk about populist antitrust. Well, so did Gail Slater when she took over at DOJ. So there is some commonality there. I think the big difference that I see is that in the Biden administration there wasn't a lot of counterpoint to that populist push in the Democratic Party or in the Biden administration. There's some evidence that populist view of antitrust may be a little more skin deep in the Trump administration, given some recent events that we may hear more about later. But certainly there's a little bit more of a pro-business counterpoint. Very importantly, though, that does not signal a return to, I think, careful, economically guided, analytic antitrust. because you can be just as unprincipled in a sort of, more pro-business approach than you can as you can in a populist approach. And some of the hollowing out of the institutions and damage to the institutions that may have started in the Biden administration may be accelerating or have gotten even stronger in the current administration. So even though we may be seeing some kind of shift, at least on the margins regarding certain cases, I don't think we're seeing a restoration of the old order and the old way of, or I don't want to say the old order. I think the order, the pre-Biden administration order of analyzing, thinking about antitrust cases. We may be in a highly politicized new world.
Christopher, in addition to answering the question about what you think the Biden legacy is, maybe you could also address the question about carry over to Trump too. I mean, as everybody has indicated, there's a fairly strong populist flavor on both sides. So, I mean, we may not have enough evidence to determine exactly where Trump too lies on the spectrum between traditional antitrust and the Biden administration's approach to antitrust. Is it closer to one side than the other, or right in the middle? I don't know. But maybe you could talk about some of those things. Yeah.
I think you're asking a question on everyone's mind. What's fascinating, at big international confabs like the International Competition Network, everyone wanted to find out what the US regulators were thinking and didn't have the kind of indications they were hoping for. And I would say Wall Street, the deal flow, many people thought it would start up under the new administration, has not picked up with the rapidity. It looks like they're hanging back and waiting. Whether that'll change with recent events remains to be seen. And so we end up trying to read tea leaves. And what's fascinating is you see statements about both from Gail Slater and Andrew Ferguson saying we need to get business, liberate business and let them continue to innovate. You see a preference for ex-ante regulation, a preference for conventional antitrust over ex-ante regulation, and abandoning the idea. At the same time, in their early speeches, they start talking about things like we need to protect forgotten workers and forgotten small businesses as well as consumers. And this is not conventional consumer welfare. You see themes about returning to conservative roots, and Gail Slater talked about the Granger movement as a return to the movements in one of her big speeches. And so we find ourselves looking at these indications and trying to figure out what they mean in terms of enforcement policy and what they're going to do on a going forward basis. And I also think the other big question is whether Andrew Ferguson has a Mark Meadow problem. He needs 3 Republican votes to do anything, and Mark Meadow has endorsed ideas such as big is bad, vertical integration is bad, and that he has cited the neo-Brandeisians with approval. And so you look at where he stands and to try to figure it out, and he says things that law is primarily an exercise in policy and morality. Antitrust's law is in policy and morality, not economics. So we have kind of a mixed bag when we try to look at the public statements made by the leading enforcement agencies, and it's kind of hard. What we see, they kept the Biden-era merger guidelines, and the cases have continued, and the way they've been litigated are some indicators. On the other hand, I am getting conversations from people, some friends of mine in the enforcement agencies who frankly said matters that would have gone forward in enforcement under the previous administration are not going forward. And so on a scuttlebutt sort of level, they do see a change in enforcement policy, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. I did want to say, a couple things about the Times. I love Howard's comment and the comment about Carl's comment. We had Lena Khan to Penn as well, and we sold out the house. I mean, we had to take tickets, and I asked my students, so that was great. Who should we do next year? Who could attract that kind of audience? And the answer was nobody. I mean, she had a special hold, and there is an aspect of it which is uniquely personal to her. But I'm wondering if she isn't just, to the extent to which she might have childhood, the Biden administration might have been a moment that there's some signs globally that it may have passed. So what's fascinating to me is you're seeing the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, who had gone on a regulatory first presidency, issued her political guidelines, which is essentially her platform, and she said, I'm going to focus on prosperity and competitiveness, streamlining regulations, cutting red tape, and reducing administrative burdens. And then you have the Draghi report that says Europe is facing an existential choice. Productivity is half what it is in the US. Then you see the UK firing the head of their Competition and Markets Authority for being insufficiently focused on growth and offering a strategic steer, saying they need to prioritize growth and investment. You see Australia going on a productivity kick where they're saying we need to stop regulating for risk, we need to regulate for growth and deal with the risk. And you see a really, in my mind, and this is true in the conversations I have all over the world, a very fundamental different conversation that makes the position of the Biden administration may have been a moment in time that the global discourse shows may be passing. And as we write history, we don't know. We won't know for a while what that legacy is going to be. But what we see coming out of the statements of the current administration, but also globally, suggests that the appetite. I'll tell you, when I've been going around the world, 12 months ago, the big question was, should other countries follow the DMA? Is this just inevitable? And do we need to get on the train? I would say the chance of another country adopting the DMA right now is virtually zero. I think Uzbekistan may be the only one, and possibly Turkey because of the EU ties. But beyond that, in all the other countries I'm going to, they're either dead or in the words of a friend of mine in India, on life support. They're not completely dead, but and I think that we will see the legacy of the Biden administration in a different way, I think, in a few years after we see all this plays out.
Well, Christopher has said a little bit about the legacy, but I'd like to hear the views of the rest of the panel on what they think the legacy of the Biden administration will be. In particular, what the courts will do with various cases. I mean, I have read some articles of people saying, they think that the legacy will be minimal, after all is said and done. So maybe could start with Howard and go down this way, or.
Look, I mean, I think the legacy will be this. I mean, one way to think about a positive aspect of the legacy will be a rethinking of our error cost trade-offs in antitrust versus over-enforcement and under-enforcement. And I think that there was a lot of concern over a lot of years about over-enforcement. There was a shifted focus to under-enforcement that I think in a lot of ways was probably overdue. But that also can be overdone and over-rotated on, and I definitely think that happened. And so the extent to which there will be a course correction and that will lead to healthy debate, I think is unclear. So that is one possibility of a positive legacy, which is that we sort of rethink our risk trade-offs and ask hard questions about whether we under-enforced. It was an iconoclastic moment where a lot of the received economic analysis, received kinds of presumptions, and received sort of concerns about over-enforcement were sort of torn down. And I think it will take a little bit of time to see how that plays out. I don't think there will be an immediate course correction or rejection of that. What worries me about that is, there were decades of learning that went into sort of the economic trade-offs, the economic analysis, that varied over time, that went into antitrust. And to the extent that those analytic structures have been tossed out, along with some of the doctrinal kinds of trade-offs, some risk trade-offs, I think that is deeply problematic. And the thing that worries me most is that we may be in an era where being able to point to possible harms or things that may be bad are adequate for certain kinds of investigations and enforcement without the underlying analytical structure to understand whether they in fact were bad. So I think we're going to be in a rebuilding period and a relearning period, I think probably for a number of years. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Hopefully we'll emerge better. So I think there was good and bad in the legacy, and while we do see some shifts around the world, as Christopher pointed out, I don't expect any kind of immediate swerve or reversal. I think that there will be a little bit of time for the courts, for policymakers to figure out what the path forward is and how to rebalance antitrust going forward.
So Chris, you said Biden administration may have been a moment in time. I think there's a lot to that as we see this going on in other countries, and more generally these shifts back from some of this thinking. But I would say more of it happens every 30 or 40 years or something. I mean, we had the same type of thing in the 60s. That is, by which I mean there is a sense that Americans don't generally like big business. They think they're kind of too powerful and they're not giving them a fair deal. I mean, the survey evidence is really clear on this. So antitrust looks like a solution, right? This is the body of law that's supposed to control corporate power, but it can only do so much. So this was another episode where people grabbed onto that, hoping antitrust could do more than it can, realistically, given the law, the statutes, and given the courts. So I think that is going to fade. Okay, it's another attempt that didn't really work out. Okay, to use antitrust to solve these bigger social problems. Then you mentioned courts and law, so I think that's really important. You know, when if you think of a legacy of an administration in antitrust, it's going to either be establishing ideas that hold and work. I mean, that's what the Reagan administration did. That's what Bill Baxter did with different. How do we view it? And that was part of the pushback. We learned a lot from mistakes in the 60s and 70s. Look, I'm no fan of Robert Bork, but he had a bunch of good points in his book, Antitrust Paradox. So the problem with the neo-Brandeisians, they had no intellectual core. I mean, they couldn't really engage. It's just there's nothing there, from an academic, if you will, intellectual, just foundation. So there's nothing there to hold on to. That just was shifting sands. And then in the case law, on the merger side, they basically litigated cases like we had done it under the 2010 merger guidelines and through the Obama years and in the Bush years before that. So they didn't develop new case law that meant much of anything on merger. And the monopolization stuff, it's too soon to say. Okay, I mean, it might make a real difference there, one way or the other. Okay, I think some of the appeals courts, not less the Supreme Court, are not going to be very sympathetic, but let's just see. Okay, so that legacy is open. And then the third piece I want to mention is the politicization, which relates to what you said about the declining role of expertise. It's not just economics, it's antitrust attorney, just the case law and how do we, there's a rich body of really fascinating cases over 100 plus years. How do we do all sorts of things that have happened in our economy, and the antitrust has grappled with this, whether it was the industrial era and the Alcoa case or the IBM case or AT&T and so forth. So this is now moving away from that to a more politicization of antitrust enforcement. And and the FTC was part of that. The institution was damaged, okay, and I think it increases the chance there won't be an FTC in 5 or 10 years from now, for example. So that I think, and that's part of again broader sets of the decline of role of expertise, of politicization, particularly under the current administration, right? That's happening, broadly, and that happened in antitrust during the Biden administration, and now even. Well, we say more, so we're not continuing under the Trump 2.0. So that, to me, I worry about the outcomes. I mean, of course, anybody like us, people say, oh, you're just trying to defend your turf as a bunch of experts. But okay, I actually think expertise is useful when it comes to vaccines. Okay, I think expertise is useful when it comes to diplomacy, and in economic and tech policy too. But, that's, the power is shifting away from that. And we saw that to some degree in Biden antitrust already.
So, Dennis, in addition to, we were talking a little bit about what you think the long-term legacy, if we know it, of the Biden antitrust is. I also want to get to the news of the last, whatever it was, month. I can't remember exactly when it happened. We're going to hear from Roger Alford at lunch, and of what the longer-term implications might be of the firings of two senior antitrust division officials, and what's that going to mean over time?
Well, as I said at the outset of my remarks, there's been this populist sentiment to, I think, demote the role of expertise, and I saw that in the Biden administration. To the extent we're seeing that in the Trump administration, I I would say that's the wrong direction, and that if you instead appeal to popular sentiment to make decisions and having to intervene into agencies to make sure they agree with the popular sentiments when their expertise tells them differently, I think it's just a bad route to go down. And one of the things that you see over the last several years is this increasing reliance on appeal for political acceptance. And one of the aspects that's occurred in the United States is we seem to like a lot of the interventionist policy of the EU. Well, I don't think that's put them in the correct direction. If you look at the Draghi report, it said, we're getting clobbered here in the EU because we're stifling investment. If you look at the top companies in the world, and you ask how many of them are in Europe, you don't find very many. I think out of the top 10, there are 0. Out of the top 25, there are 2. So that route is a wrong way to go. If you start to, the more you start regulating and interfering, that actually can harm small businesses, which is supposedly one of the things the neo-Brandesians wanted to stimulate. Regulation is a fixed cost on firms, oftentimes, and that can weigh down especially the small firms. So any departure from relying on what people know, people who have been experienced in the field. Now, as Carl says, you know, I'm an economist, so you probably think I'm trying to promote economics. Well, I think economics has a lot to say. I think antitrust attorneys have a lot of expertise. So it worries me when we don't rely on that. And one of the things you can really say is that if you look at everybody, one of the things I'm worried about, especially in a high-tech conference like this, we were worried about technological diffusion throughout the world. If everybody across the world has their own regulations on privacy, on this, on that, that's going to be a mess, okay? So I'm just worried the more we intervene for non-expert purpose, based not on expertise, the more trouble we'll have. And I'll just end with one comment. I have argued for years that when the Justice Department or the FTC, and I used to be in the Justice Department, and I said this when I was in the Justice Department, when we bring a case, or don't bring a case, I want to know why. What did we predict, and what did the opposing side predict? And then what happened? Who turned out to be right? Unless we build a body of evidence like that, and we're starting to, and you know, over time we get more and more retrospectives. But that should be a requirement of every government decision that can be documented. And then we'll keep learning what works, what doesn't work. It's easy to say, I'm going to stop this merger, potential competition. That guy someday would have woken up and figured out this great new idea in competition with the person who wants to buy him. Maybe. How do you know? What happened in the last case that you said, that you stopped and you said that person was a potential entrant? Where did that person go? Did he enter the industry or didn't? These aren't, you know, unusual questions, it seems to me, but we need to get the answer to those questions. But the short answer to your question is, the less we rely on people who have immersed themselves for years in the industry, the less reliable our policies are going to become.
Okay, yeah, Carl, and then I want to move on to some content-related issues. But
When I was the chief economist at the Justice Department during the Obama years, often we'd go on for a major matter. We'd go upstairs to the Attorney General's office, meet with Eric Holder, tell him what we were doing. He'd ask some questions. Nothing I ever saw indicated there was instructions coming down from above, like don't do this for some political reason or not. So that was the world I saw. And then when I moved over to the White House, we were very careful I had all my friends, I just moved from the Justice Department, not to talk about cases across that boundary. Obviously that's a norm that has fallen away norms aren't doing so well these days, in case you hadn't heard. Look, that's been breached here, in a big way, in a visible way. And the other thing I'd say is, in terms of antitrust enforcement, this has got to be these firings, this whole whatnot, it's got to be very dispiriting for this career staff too. I mean, not, just like, you do your work and then somebody comes, not even based on the work within the antitrust division, and gets overruled. The culture there is very much of a, we're here for law enforcement, and the political leaders are entitled to make decisions about which enforcement acts bring. But when it's blatantly political and not based on the rule of law, ultimately, that's just discouraging if you're working in the Justice Department, and I imagine other parts of the government. So this worries me a great deal, and of course, I'll say it signals to the companies who are looking about deals is hire somebody to go lobby whatever, and that's what we're going to be looking for at the next few years. And it's not just antitrust, of course, where that kind of open for business situation is going on, and I'm very troubled by it.
So Christopher wanted to say something, but then I'd like to move on to the fact that a lot of the rhetoric coming from both the FTC and the DOJ early on was related to content on the major platforms. And my question is, regardless of whether whether it was unduly, your view of whether it was unduly biased against conservative voices or not, the question really is under what circumstances, or are there any circumstances under which content moderation is an antitrust issue?
So one comment about the legacy of the Biden administration is we have a judicial system, not an administrative system. So until it gets litigated to judgment, it doesn't matter. You have to convince a judge. Second, it has to go through appeals, and eventually, if you want, it's a long-term project to get it through Supreme Court precedent change. And we never got there. So the idea that it's still at the enforcement level, which is influential, but we still have a long way to go. I do find striking the politicization. In fact, as Carl said correctly, one of the reasons we adopted the consumer welfare standard is to get politics out of this. And one of the we forget, I mean, people talk about often in this discourse, talk about the Chicago school, which is to me and always followed as an ad hominem attempt to try to attack it, the consumer welfare standard. We forget that it did not get anywhere until the Harvard school, backed by Philip Arita and Donald Turner, had their so-called conversion and endorsed it. And the moderates joining that is really what brought that about. And we had this decades of learning where we abandoned structural conduct performance. And we understood over the last 60 years is that, forgive me, Dennis, that vertical integration may be harmful and may be beneficial, but that puts it into traditional antitrust and determines presumptions and burdens of proof. And we seem to be walking, as Howard's saying, away from all this. And it's sort of being accelerated to me by a couple things I see problematic. The tendency to appoint Hill people instead of antitrust professionals into key positions. And I also see it latent in Cantor's, I don't know if this is on your radar, Cantor's attack on experts. Jonathan Cantor led an attack to get, there's the major gathering of international competition enforcement officials, that's called the International Competition Network. He wanted, and they normally have what they call non-governmental advisors, they're experts to help the process. He barred all the US. We had got a bunch, we didn't appoint any. And was trying to get them out of the OECD's competition committee. And he was, why? Because the experts were telling him no, based on economic analysis, and he didn't, and was interfering with his political goals. And so I understand that we have problems now, and the White House intervention to me is incredibly problematic, and that's really bizarre, but it goes deeper than that. I think there's legacies that goes back in a disregard for the kind of economic learning you're hearing most of us endorse. Now, on content, I actually think that politically, there is a lot of move to try to curb the big tech companies for reasons that have nothing to do with competition, but they're finding at the federal level a lot of trouble getting that moving in terms of actual action, and so they're turning to antitrust because they want to whack them somehow. And the big thing that's looming out there is the First Amendment, is that we have the decision in the net choice cases coming off Texas and Florida attempts to do this, and it's The decision itself went on the procedural posture of the case that didn't actually reach the merits, but a majority of the court dropped an opinion that was really influential on the merits that strongly suggests that any attempt to do this is not on the basis of content is almost certainly going to fail if it defines it in terms of non-discrimination based on political viewpoint. That's pretty clear. Whether content issues, here, could content issues rise? The answer, I'm very much reminded by, the answer is yeah. I think about, some things are garden variety fraud. They can eventually rise to the point where there's frauds that have hurt markets. You see there's privacy cases in Germany where they're saying there's conventional privacy violations, which we have privacy law to deal with. They ask the question, could a systematic privacy policy be violated in a way that ultimately would affect markets? And so the answer is in the abstract, yes. But the problem with content is actually regulating it has proven to be incredibly difficult if you look at the legacy of FCC stuff. And it's been remarkably hard. My favorite one is we tried to rate regulate cable. And the empirical study suggests that quality-adjusted rates went up. Why? The way you preserve a margin when you cap your price is degrade the product. So unless you're going to get comprehensive quality regulation, which we don't know how to do in media, this is a tough haul. And so I wonder if the price and quantity innovation tools that we have traditionally in antitrust are going to be fit for purpose.
So here, I wrote an article with Aaron Edlin that you can find on the Pro Market blog called "The FTC is Threatening Free Speech." And so what Andrew Ferguson has done as chair of the FTC is go after what he calls censorship by the tech platforms, okay? But what censorship is a form of, what they're doing is a form of content moderation, right? What they want to highlight, allow on, feature or not. So, this is a good example of the FTC being used for, obviously, the political purposes that serve the White House, and many Republicans right now. So then the question is that even legitimate for the FTC to do that? Now, the FTC, Joe Simons told the Trump White House in 1.0, we're not going there, that's not our business to do that. But now they have a different chair. There's always a hook with antitrust. It's, well, maybe there's collusion going on. So if it was collusion, that would be illegal, okay? But that's just kind of made up. And so that's the problem, is antitrust is potentially broad enough, particularly when you bring in the word collusion, that, it's not out of the question that it could be antitrust. And but if you're going to go there, it's just dangerous when there's no evidence of that, and it's for political purposes. And this is stifling free speech. That's just plain and simple. So we need to push back against that.
Yeah, I think there are distinctions you can make. A cartel of all the social media and all the broadcast networks that says not putting Dennis Carlton's messages on, that could be an antitrust violation. If one of them says, I think Dennis Carlton's I'm not going to put any of his stuff on, it's hard to see why that's an antitrust violation. Suppose there's a standard-setting bureau that of all responsible publishers, and they promulgate standards. That is a harder question about standard-setting organizations, and I think you would have to be very careful to balance free speech against coordinated action. That is a hook they could use, but just to use it for one media source to keep Dennis Carlton off the air, that strikes me as not that anyone pays attention to my views, but that would strike me as
I think we all pay
something
attention
bad.
to your views. Well, we're supposed to have lots of Slido questions, but then I don't know exactly how to get them to show up here. But so they used to show it. Last year they just showed up. So I'll take questions the old-fashioned way, if they're, well, Steve and then Baron. And then that'll be more than our time.
Thanks, Tom. Steve Del Bianco from NetChoice. And when Howard mentioned the notion that maybe there's some pushback in the White House on the current form of content moderation populism, it might be coming from another branch of populism, because America First populism would seem to favor national economic growth, competitiveness against China, developing AI, quantum computing, energy unleashed. I mean, that's populist too, but does it serve a useful purpose? if it counters the really pernicious populism of punishing companies that might not be favorable to conservatives?
No, look, I think it's a great question. I mean, there's always been a debate about the extent to which industrial policy and competition policy should coexist and where should the trade-offs occur. And I think you're right that the sort of nationalism that is embedded in an industrial policy like the recent AI order, which by the way may have a lot to it, right? There can be a lot of sense to that, is a bit of a pushback to some of the anti-bigness concerns, which is why you see a lot of debate. And sort of, we had Gail Slater early on say, industrial policy is one thing, it doesn't affect competition policy. You get the administration coming in and actually ordering the antitrust agencies to revisit investigations that might have been launched and under the last administration, but continued by the current officials. So I do think that that is a counterpoint, and I do think that there's a significant debate. Listening to Chad's very interesting talk this morning, what are the implications for economic growth and sort of strategic leadership and safety to not having the lead in certain critical industries? And I think the debate between antitrust and industrial policy should be separated from the populist debate within antitrust policy, but it certainly has an effect on it.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. I'm not sure I've ever disagreed with Christopher before. Such a thoughtful person, but I have to respond to what you said about your comment that it doesn't matter until the Supreme Court says something. In fact, it does. It does matter. What's happening now is not that the courts are changing the law necessarily, but that the regulatory state is being weaponized in all sorts of small ways to coerce changes in content moderation and in the exercise of editorial discretion. And the great example of this that just came out Friday evening was an opinion from a district court judge detailing the ways that a subpoena was used against Media Matters to retaliate against them merely for commenting on the kinds of speech at issue. So my question is, given the reality of jawboning, of the weaponization of law, the bringing of flimsy legal claims to achieve great results, to coerce, for example, Omnicom, which will now be the largest family of advertising agencies, into agreeing not to engage in political and ideological bias. Given that reality, that the government can, in fact, jawbone and bypass the courts, how do we think about the agency, and in particular, the personnel running it? And I just would close with just saying that Mark Meador, you've made clear his views, I will predict that he will run the commission as a single commissioner. It's clear that Commissioner Holyoke apparently is going to be put at the FTC.
So the quick answer is, the question, my answer was in response to the legacy, the antitrust legacy of the Biden era. And I think the longer term, that's a much longer term question, and about legacy is a different one. Is this having a real work impact today? Yes. This is not an antitrust issue. The weaponization of enforcement agencies across the board is having an adverse impact on citizens, our principles, and the rule of law. There's no question about that to me. The best example I can think has nothing to do with antitrust. There for a long time, a strong tradition in the State Department called the dissent channel, which is if a low-level official disagreed with something went on, they had a way to communicate it up the chain without retaliation. That channel has really has died. That's a loss. And those are self-disciplining things that we used to do within agencies, like the guardrails that Carl talked about before between the White House and the DOJ, which are a big deal, which is, I didn't mean to minimize when I said answer to the long-term antitrust legacy, it will ultimately determine by the court.
Well, I think we do have to move along, unfortunately. So I want to thank the panel for a great discussion.
I'm totally here to ruin everyone's fun. Okay, so.